What would happen in Canada if there was a nationwide disaster that paralyzed the grid for a prolonged period of time? In this series, we speculate on what the outcomes might be. In the first installment of this special edition After the Collapse series that's exploring Canada in a grid-down situation, we surveyed the West Coast and interior BC for their post-collapse survivability. In this video, we are going to move eastwards towards the Canadian Rocky Mountains and the province of Alberta and analyze how this region may be affected post-collapse. You can show your support for the After the Collapse series by liking, commenting, and sharing this video on other social media platforms. And make sure you click the bell next to the subscribe button to ensure that you're getting notifications when videos are posted. Enjoy the video. Alberta, like British Columbia, is a very geographically diverse province. In Alberta, you'll find everything from tundra to boreal forest to Rocky Mountains to the Badlands to the grasslands, and transitioning into the Great Plains, which will be the topic of our next video. Now we start with the Rocky Mountains that span nearly 3,000 kilometers from northern BC to New Mexico. Within the Rocky Mountains, you'll find the Continental Divide. This is a pivotal geographical point that runs through this mountain range that separates the water that runs west into the Pacific and east into the Atlantic. This region is characterized by endless mountain peaks and some of the cleanest water on Earth that flows from the glaciers of the Columbia ice fields. Within this region, you have one of the largest groupings of national parks in Canada and protected habitat for wildlife and pristine wilderness. This is all maintained by a small population of locals who host millions of tourists every year. Now, in terms of the resources in the Rocky Mountains, wild edibles are going to be limited to a very short growing season. I'm talking about the natural herbs and berries that you might find growing on the mountainside. There's an abundance of wild game in this region simply because of the fact that a lot of this is protected right now. In addition to this, a lot of the wildlife is very human friendly because it's so used to seeing tourists. A lot of the wildlife within this region have probably seen humans and are very trusting of humans. But because they've been protected, they've never been hunted. So hunting in this region is literally going to be like shooting fish in a barrel, but only for a very short time because these populations will be quickly wiped out or pushed back into the far reaches of the forest, where people are for the most part incapable of traversing without modern technology to get them there. Now, if the lights were to go out in the two nearby metropolises of Edmonton and Calgary, it's quite possible that if there were a mass evacuation from those cities, most people's gas tanks would get them somewhere in the vicinity of this conglomeration of national parks. And as such, it's likely that the abundance of wildlife that's been preserved within this region would probably be quickly wiped out by the swarms of refugees. Now, as indicated before, this is probably one of the few places on Earth where you can still drink from streams and rivers because they do flow directly from the glaciers. Now, obviously, that's going to depend on the specific region you're in, because if an animal is defecating in a creek upstream to you, then you do run the risk of contracting some kind of illness, as you would anywhere else in the world. However, the risk factor for waterborne pathogens is extremely low because, like I said, all of the water flows directly from the glaciers. Alberta has absolutely no shortage of fresh water. With 20,000 square kilometers of fresh water, numerous rivers and creeks and swampland ensure that you will likely never go thirsty in Alberta. Another great source of energy to be harvested in this region and throughout most of Alberta is going to be fishing. Freshwater fish are by and large the most abundant source of energy to be had in Canada. Now, a more viable food source than this wildlife is going to be found within Alberta itself, where you're going to have about 5 million head of cattle at any given moment, which comprises about 41% of Canada's total cattle herds. There's almost 1.5 cows for every Albertan. So it's safe to say that these cows are going to be a prime target for food by looters, marauders, and refugees, and that farmers are going to have their hands full in protecting their herds. In addition, Alberta has some of the largest crop production, second only to its neighbor Saskatchewan in terms of the production of wheat. They produce the most barley out of any province, both of which are staples of the North American diet. These farms and the stockpiles that they've accumulated will also be prime targets by the needy after the collapse. Unfortunately, due to the immediacy of shit hits the fan and the mad scramble for resources, most people will not have the foresight to continue to breed animals and to not simply just kill them off right away for food, and most people aren't going to have the foresight to plant seeds come springtime. But in terms of the amount of available food then, Alberta is going to be a relatively safe place to be. One of the main challenges in a grid down scenario in Alberta in terms of food production is going to be the fact that by and large the system depends on technology in order to achieve this peak production. None of this is achievable without the just-in-time delivery system which runs on oil, which will be in very short supply after any local, regional, or global collapse. It's quite likely that the numerous forts within Alberta and many places in Canada may re-emerge as viable trading posts. To this day, fur trapping is a viable business endeavor, and this practice is likely only going to increase as people come to rely once again on the natural fibers that help shield them from the frigid Canadian winters. And to this day, no synthetic garment made by man can compare to the warmth generated by nature's natural fibers and furs. It's also important to understand the complex network of river systems that run from the glaciers in western Alberta eastwards towards the Great Plains and the Atlantic. There's a common understanding in wilderness survival, and it's that if you follow a river long enough, you eventually will find civilization. Each one of Alberta's major urban centers is built along one of these major river systems. These river systems will also serve as a means of transportation, especially if moving west to east, as the rivers tend to flow in that direction. This may also be a much safer way to travel, but nonetheless there will always be security risks. But bear in mind, human settlements, as they have in the past, will gravitate towards these river systems. And if you do plan on traversing using them, you should expect that you are going to find villages along the way. Now, Alberta is also home to the Athabasca oil sands, which contains some of the largest heavy crude oil deposits on Earth. Unfortunately, the extraction methods used to get at this estimated 133,000 million barrels of oil requires immense amount of energy, technology, and communication, which simply won't be available in a grid down situation. It's also one of the most environmentally destructive mining processes on Earth. This, however, has made Alberta into one of the wealthiest provinces in Canada, with one of the highest per capita incomes, topping 6 figures in some regions. Post-collapse oil production and refinement is a topic that doesn't get a lot of attention because a lot of people don't view it as being feasible without modern technology at our side. It should be noted, however, that there are thousands of people within this region that understand the process of oil extraction and refinement so well that it should be expected that when powered by innovative grid-down energy sources, we'll be able to continue the exploitation and production of oil post-collapse, long after the lights go out. Now, in the wintertime in Alberta, and anywhere in Canada for that matter, people are going to tend towards warmer climates to escape the death sentence that is the Canadian winter. The warmest part of the province is in the south. This is due to a phenomena called Chinook winds, which carry warm Pacific air over the mountain ranges into lower Alberta. This can cause temperature fluctuations of up to 25 degrees Celsius in just a matter of a few hours. Many urban dwellers, in an attempt to keep warm, will be using their fireplaces or just be starting fires within their homes, trying to keep warm however they can. Of course, this is going to lead to many instances of carbon monoxide poisoning and fires. In the dead of Canadian winter in the heart of Alberta, people will be scrambling towards any source of heat that they can find, even if it means putting themselves at risk. In the short term at least, governments may attempt to mitigate this issue by using whatever energy sources remain to heat designated arenas and buildings. We all know what these refugee camps are going to look like. If Hurricane Katrina is any reminder of what a government refugee camp is going to look like, I'm sure most of us would choose to avoid that situation. It should go without saying that the longer the absence of rule of law persists, the further and further you would want to be from the major urban centers in Alberta. Now, before we talk about security, we need to talk about the population density of the province. The highest population densities are around the Calgary and Edmonton region, the two major metropolises within this region, which both have 1 million plus inhabitants. It is the fourth largest province in terms of population, with a combined total of 4.5 million people. Reportedly, 70% of these individuals are of Caucasian descent. The majority of the population in Alberta resides in the central and southern portions of the province. The north is largely uninhabited, with the exception of Fort McMurray and Grand Prairie, both of which are very isolated communities where there are few ways in and few ways out. There's approximately 260,000 legal gun owners in Alberta, and it's a very gun-friendly province. In fact, it's a common cultural understanding in Canada, the fact that Alberta is to Canada what Texas is to the United States, in terms of politics, culture, and even resources. Due to the quote-unquote redneck culture of Alberta, it's safe to say that you're probably going to find one of the highest proportion of preppers in Canada within this region. This may be a mitigating factor post-collapse, as a higher proportion of people will be prepared to weather the storm. Alberta is also home to nearly 220,000 people who describe as being of First Nations or Aboriginal descent. Among these Aboriginal groups are the Cree, Blackfoot, Dene, and Ojibwe. Although many of these native populations have long since been domesticated through forced enculturation practices like the residential school system, there are many who still do live off the land and, in the very least, have an affinity with the Canadian landscape. It should be expected that you will see some regional conflict as a result of refugees diffusing from the major urban centers into the rural communities. Many people within these rural communities are adept at using firearms, if only for the purpose of hunting and target shooting, but they will likely have their hands full to not be overwhelmed by the hundreds of thousands of refugees pouring out of the major urban centers of Edmonton and Calgary. Many farmers are going to have their hands full trying to defend themselves against roving gangs of cattle rustlers. And due to limited transportation and the ability to import feed, it's quite possible that many of these herds will return into a form of pastoral nomadism, where people move their home base in accordance with the needs of their herd. It's important to remember that these millions of cows are what replaced the millions of buffalo that used to freely roam this region, and provided the native peoples of the Great Plains sustenance and shelter. Most of these buffalo are now extinct, but it's to be expected that in the absence of the presence of the modern industrious man, these populations will begin to replenish themselves in a relatively short period of time. Stay tuned for part 2 of this installment of the After the Collapse series, which will be released tomorrow. And if you want to experience the After the Collapse series as a whole, I will post a link to the playlist, which contains dozens of videos that are similar to this one. Don't forget to show your support for the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing, sharing the video on other social media platforms, and by all means, feel free to donate using the PayPal donation link through my main channel's page. This helps to fund these projects. And stick with me as we move eastwards, exploring the Canadian landscape post-collapse. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.